What if the dead could call us? Not from the grave, but from the mountain that never gave them back. High in the frozen reaches of Russia's Ural mountains lies Dyatlov Pass, a place whispered about in equal parts wonder and dread. To some, it is just another patch of snow and stone, but to others, it is a graveyard of unanswered questions, where 9 hikers vanished under circumstances so strange that decades later, the silence still rattles louder than any explanation. This story isn't simply about a tragedy. It's about echoes, the kind that linger long after the voices are gone, twisting through static, memory, and fear. A final call, real or imagined, that reaches across time to anyone who dares listen. So tonight, step into the cold with me, where every unanswered call still drifts in the wind, waiting for someone to answer. They say the cold of the Ural Mountains does not simply bite, it consumes. In January of 1959, 9 young hikers set out across this unforgiving landscape, their hearts warmed by laughter, songs, and the thrill of adventure. Led by Igor Dyatlov, they were strong, experienced, and determined to conquer the challenge ahead. Photographs taken along the way show smiling faces framed by heavy coats, snow glittering like crushed glass behind them. To the untrained eye, these were just snapshots of joy. Yet when viewed now, they feel like fragments of a countdown, the last moments of warmth before the cold claimed everything. The expedition began as so many others had. The hikers carried skis, journals, cameras, and a sense of camaraderie that only comes when a group shares both danger and dream. Each diary entry was filled with optimism. They joked about their meals, teased one another, and made plans for what they would do once they returned. Nothing in their words suggested fear. Nothing suggested the shadows waiting in the mountains ahead, but the Ural Mountains are deceptive. Their vast white fields look still, almost peaceful, but they hide forces that bend both body and mind. Snowstorms roll in without warning, winds howl with a pitch so sharp it feels almost like a scream, and the temperature sinks low enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Even seasoned hikers can falter here. Yet these 9 pressed forward, unaware that their trail was leading them not toward triumph, but into legend. On February the 1st, the group set up camp on the slope of Kolat-Syachol, a name the local Mansi people knew well. It meant the Mountain of the Dead. To outsiders, this might sound like superstition, folklore woven to frighten the unwary. But as the hikers carved their tent into the snow that night, the name took on a weight that no one could yet comprehend. Imagine it. A single tent glowing faintly against the endless dark. Snow drifting down in silence, and inside, 9 friends huddled together, sharing warmth against the vast emptiness. Their laughter must have echoed faintly across the slopes, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Outside, the mountain watched in silence. We do not know what happened when the night deepened. What we do know is chilling. The tent would be found later, ripped open from the inside. Their belongings, food, boots, even coats, all left behind. It was as if something had driven them into the snow, barefoot and unprotected, with such urgency that survival no longer mattered. Why would experienced hikers abandon shelter in such a way? What force could be so terrifying, so immediate, that instinct itself seemed broken? These questions would echo through the decades. And with them, another, even darker thought. Did the hikers try to send a message before the silence closed in? Because sometimes, before a life is cut short, there is a final attempt to be heard. When the hikers failed to return, concern quickly spread among their families and friends. At first, there was hope. Perhaps the snow had slowed their progress, or perhaps they had chosen to extend their journey. But as days turned into weeks, hope curdled into dread. Search parties were dispatched, braving the very storms that had swallowed the group. They expected to find weary hikers trudging back toward safety. Instead, what they uncovered only deepened the mystery. The first discovery came on February 26th, almost a month after the group had last been seen.
Rescuers found the tent.
It stood eerily intact against the slope, yet something was profoundly wrong. It had been slashed open from the inside,
as if the hikers had clawed their way out in desperation.
Inside lay their belongings: boots, coats, journals, food. Everything needed to survive the brutal cold was still there. But the hikers themselves were gone. Tracks in the snow revealed their next movements. Bare footprints, some deep, some shallow, led away from the camp. They stretched for hundreds of meters before fading into the frozen landscape. Imagine it: 9 trained hikers in freezing temperatures, fleeing half-dressed into the night.
No enemy had left signs of pursuit.
No avalanche had buried their camp. It was as if they were running not from nature, but from something unseen. The first bodies were discovered beneath a tree, nearly a mile from the tent. They had tried to build a small fire, their frozen hands clutching broken branches. Stripped of much of their clothing, their feet bare against the snow, they huddled together in a futile attempt to survive. Their faces, though lifeless, seemed caught in the same silent question that would torment investigators. What had driven them out here? As searchers pressed deeper, they uncovered more. 3 bodies lay scattered between the tree and the tent, positioned as though they were desperately trying to return. Their postures told a grim story, crawling, staggering, collapsing one by one,
as though the mountain itself had pulled them down. The final 4 bodies would not be found until months later, buried under snow in a ravine.
These remains presented even greater horrors: fractured ribs, crushed skulls, and injuries so severe they resembled the aftermath of a car crash, yet with no external wounds to explain such force. Stranger still, some of the clothing carried traces of radiation. How could such damage exist in the heart of a frozen wilderness with no evidence of weapons or predators? Each discovery unraveled the mystery further instead of solving it. The tent, the tracks, the scattered bodies, each detail raised questions that refused answers. The investigators grew uneasy. Some whispered of experiments gone wrong. Others hinted at something even more unearthly. Officially, the case would be marked as caused by a compelling natural force. But to those who walked among the evidence, that phrase explained nothing. Standing at the site, one searcher reportedly said, "It felt as if the mountain was keeping its secrets, and we had no right to pry." Yet secrets have a way of seeping through. No notes were found, no radio messages, no written goodbye. And yet legends began to swirl of a signal, a faint, distorted cry across static, as though the hikers had tried to send one last call into the dark. If such a call existed, then perhaps the mountain was not silent at all. Perhaps it was still speaking, only not everyone was meant to hear. When investigators gathered their reports and evidence, they expected clarity.
Instead, every piece of the puzzle seemed to contradict the last.
The Dyatlov tragedy was not a single story. It was a maze of theories, each leading deeper into darkness. And the more answers people searched for, the stranger the questions became. The most common explanation was the avalanche theory. Some argued the hikers heard the ominous rumble of snow shifting and cut their way out of the tent to escape. But when experts studied the site, they found no signs of an avalanche. The slope was too shallow and the tent remained upright. If the mountain had buried them, how could their belongings remain untouched? The avalanche theory seemed logical, but logic fell apart against the evidence. Another possibility: the group was attacked. Some believed the Mansi, the local indigenous people, had struck in defense of their sacred land. Yet there were no signs of struggle, no footprints besides the hikers' own. The Mansi themselves joined the search, and their sorrow at the discovery was genuine. The attack theory faded, leaving behind only whispers. Then came the suggestion of military involvement. The injuries, crushed ribs, fractured skulls, radiation on the clothing. These details felt too unusual for nature alone. Some speculated the hikers stumbled into secret tests, perhaps parachute mines or experimental weapons. Could the blast wave from such weapons have caused internal damage without leaving wounds on the skin? Could the radiation be proof of something hidden in the snow? But if so, why no evidence of debris, no equipment, no reports of military presence in the area? As the search for truth stretched on, more theories emerged, each more chilling than the last. Some spoke of UFOs, strange lights reported in the skies on those nights. Witnesses claimed to see glowing orbs floating above the mountains. Could an encounter with something unexplainable have sent the hikers fleeing into the snow? Skeptics dismissed this as fantasy, yet the image lingered. A group of frightened hikers, staring at lights no human could understand. Still others pointed to infrasound, a low-frequency vibration produced by the wind sweeping across the mountain slopes. Scientists suggested such vibrations could induce panic, disorientation, even hallucinations. Imagine the hikers waking in the night, their bodies filled with dread they couldn't explain, convinced they had to escape. Could that explain the frantic exit from the tent? Perhaps. But could it explain the broken bones, the missing eyes, the silence that followed? Each theory sought to bring order to chaos, but each fell short. The mountain refused to yield a single clean explanation. Instead, it left behind fragments of truth that never quite fit together, and yet one thread bound all these ideas: communication, or rather, its absence. The hikers left no written message, no diary entry, no farewell note, only the silent evidence of their fear. But soon whispers began of something else, a call, a signal, a faint transmission that surfaced long after the tragedy, carrying voices no one expected to hear. If true, then perhaps the hikers had tried to speak after all. Perhaps their words had never been lost, only waiting to be heard. For decades, Dyatlov Pass remained a mystery, frozen in time. Theories swirled, arguments raged, but the silence of the mountain remained unbroken. Then, years later, something surfaced that threatened to disturb that silence forever. A signal, a faint, crackling transmission said to have been picked up by amateur radio operators not far from the pass. It was brief, distorted, and almost entirely swallowed by static, yet some swore it carried voices. The story spread quietly at first. A handful of enthusiasts claimed they had intercepted a frequency filled with strange patterns, bursts of white noise followed by faint words, fractured syllables, and something that resembled cries. Skeptics dismissed it as atmospheric interference or malfunctioning equipment. After all, mountains are notorious for bending and bouncing signals. But others were not so quick to turn away. They replayed the recordings again and again, convinced they could make out human voices hidden inside the static. What unsettled them most was the timing. The alleged recordings often surfaced around the anniversary of the hikers' disappearance, as if the mountain itself was remembering. Some swore they could hear names whispered through the distortion: Igor, Zina, Lyudmila. Others described muffled words like help and cold. Nothing was ever clear, but it was never entirely random either. The static seemed to breathe, to pulse, as though carrying fragments of a message not meant for the living. One researcher described it this way: it was like listening to a conversation where every word was buried under snow, but you could still feel the emotion, the fear, the urgency. It didn't sound like a broadcast. It sounded like a plea. And this raised a chilling question: how could voices echo across time? Were these signals remnants of the hikers' final moments, somehow captured in the air and replayed decades later? Or were they something far stranger, an imitation, a recording not of the hikers themselves, but of the mountain keeping their cries alive. Skeptics argued for more rational explanations. They pointed to shortwave radio phenomena where signals can bounce across the globe and arrive sounding broken, eerie, and untraceable. They mentioned numbers stations, cryptic transmissions of codes and tones that often drift without origin. Could the Dyatlov call simply be an overlapping broadcast from somewhere else in the world? That answer might soothe the mind, but it did nothing to explain why so many listeners independently reported hearing the same names, the same desperate fragments. What made the story grow even more compelling was the emotional weight it carried. People who listened often described feeling changed, not terrified exactly, but unsettled, as though they had brushed against something forbidden. Some claimed they could not sleep after hearing the recordings. Others insisted the static seemed to follow them, as though the signal was not tied to a radio at all, but to the act of listening itself. It was easy to laugh off such claims. Yet, when played at low volume in a darkened room, the recordings had an undeniable pull. Even hardened skeptics admitted that the broken whispers seemed almost alive. It wasn't just sound, it was an atmosphere, the kind that made the air feel heavy, as if something unseen was leaning close, waiting for you to hear it. In the end, no one could prove the signal's origin. The tapes were too degraded, too inconclusive, but the mystery only deepened because legends do not need proof to endure. They only need to be repeated. And repeated they were, whispered across radio communities, conspiracy forums, and eventually late-night discussions among those who felt drawn to Dyatlov's chilling silence. Because if the hikers truly made a final call, then it has never stopped. It lingers, bleeding through static and memory, waiting for another ear to catch it. And that left one final dreadful thought. If you listened long enough, would the mountain whisper your name too? Strange signals are not unique to Dyatlov Pass. Throughout history, places marked by tragedy have seemed to hold on to the voices of the lost. They return, not in flesh and bone, but as echoes, fragments of sound caught between silence and memory. When researchers spoke of the mysterious Dyatlov transmission, they often compared it to other legends of voices that should no longer exist, yet somehow persist. Take the Titanic. Long after it sank in 1912, radio operators swore they heard distress signals on old maritime frequencies. Calls repeating coordinates, fragments of SOS, cries swallowed by static. Skeptics said it was interference from other ships or even atmospheric tricks. Yet the timing unsettled people. Reports of these phantom signals often came close to the anniversary of the sinking. It was as though the ocean itself had recorded the last moments of panic and refused to let them fade. The phenomenon is sometimes called residual haunting, a theory that trauma leaves behind an imprint, not a spirit but a recording. Places of intense suffering become like phonographs, replaying their final moments again and again. Could the mountain at Dyatlov be doing the same? Each gust of wind, each shift of snow, carrying with it the remnants of fear that 9 hikers unleashed in their final hours? Scientists have their own explanations. Some point to electromagnetic fields, claiming that under certain conditions, minerals and rocks can store signals, releasing them unpredictably. Others argue for infrasound, vibrations too low for human ears, but capable of stirring unease, hallucinations, even a sense of voices just beyond perception. It is a rational attempt to explain the irrational, yet it does not erase the eeriness. Because even if science can chart the how, it cannot fully explain the why. Dyatlov Pass is not alone in these mysteries. In abandoned battlefields, radio enthusiasts have reported hearing what sound like soldiers' last orders, static mixed with distant shouts. In ghost towns swallowed by deserts, travelers describe radios picking up music that vanishes as soon as the dial is touched. The world seems to hold on to certain events as though refusing to let them pass quietly into history. This is where the Dyatlov signal unsettles most. It was not random noise, nor the clean codes of a numbers station. It was fractured, emotional, almost human. People didn't just hear sounds, they felt fear radiating through the distortion. That is what makes it linger. Not the idea of a signal, but the impression of desperation carried within it. And if desperation can echo across decades, then what were the hikers truly trying to say? Was it a warning meant for others, a cry for help that never reached safety? Or could it have been something more disturbing, an invitation to step closer, to share in their fate?
Because echoes are not always harmless.
Sometimes they call not to be heard, but to be answered. And if Dyatlov's mountain is still replaying those final cries, perhaps it is because the message is not finished. Perhaps it is still waiting for someone to respond. And that thought leads us to the most unsettling possibility of all. If we ever hear the full message, what will it reveal? A warning or a trap? Those who studied the alleged Dyatlov signal agree on one point. It never played clearly from start to finish. The words, if they can even be called words, came broken, scattered as if something or someone wanted to speak but could never quite break through the static. Listeners described fragments that chilled them precisely because of their incompleteness. A crackle, followed by what sounded like run. Another burst,
Sharp and uneven, where a voice seemed to stammer, "Cold! It's so cold." Some swore they heard names.
Others insisted the syllables were too distorted to be human at all. And yet, in those distortions there was a weight, an urgency. It felt less like listening to a recording and more like overhearing a desperate plea through a wall of snow. What unsettled people most was that the signal never ended cleanly. Unlike ordinary broadcasts that fade or cut off, this one always seemed to collapse into silence. Mid-sentence, leaving the impression that something had been interrupted, almost as though whatever force carried the voices did not want the full message revealed. Researchers tried to stabilize the recordings. They ran them through filters, slowed them down, cleaned away the static. Each attempt produced the same haunting result, clearer tones, but no resolution. The words remained half-formed, the meaning half-hidden. The message was always there, just out of reach, as if teasing those who dared to listen. Some believed this was evidence of a residual call, a loop of terror replaying endlessly. Others whispered darker theories, that the voices were not remnants of the hikers at all, but something using their memory as bait, a lure to pull the curious closer to the mountain's silence. Because if you lean too close to a whisper, who's to say the whisper won't lean back?
And then there was the emotional effect.
People who listened described more than unease. They described compulsion, a need to replay the fragments to catch something new hidden inside the static. Many admitted they couldn't stop, as if the unfinished message was digging into the subconscious, planting a question that demanded an answer. What are they trying to say? This became the heart of Dyatlov's enduring terror. The hikers left no physical note, no diary entry explaining their fear. But if the signal was real, then perhaps they did leave something, a voice carried across time, shattered into pieces, still struggling to finish the sentence. And that is what makes the story so dangerous. Because unfinished messages demand completion. They linger, gnawing at the mind, pulling you deeper into speculation. Was it a warning about the mountain itself?
A description of what they saw before they fled the tent?
Or was it something no one should ever hear in full? In the end, the Dyatlov call remains broken, incomplete, and perhaps that is for the best. Because sometimes silence is safer than an answer, yet the world is not content with silence. Curiosity spread, and soon others began chasing the fragments, determined to solve them. Which leads us to the modern era, where obsession with Dyatlov's voices has taken on a life of its own. The Dyatlov tragedy should have been a story sealed in the cold of 1959, a mystery whispered about by locals, occasionally revisited by researchers and eventually left to history. But it has never faded. Instead, in the digital age, the mystery has only grown, taking on new life in forums, documentaries, podcasts, and endless YouTube channels. What once lingered in search reports and hushed speculation now thrives in the glow of modern screens. For some, the Dyatlov Pass case is an intellectual puzzle. They gather evidence, map the terrain, and recreate the hiker's route. They analyze autopsy reports, test avalanche simulations, and pore over declassified documents. These researchers search for closure, hoping science might finally untangle the contradictions. Yet the more they probe, the more the mountain seems to resist answers. Others are drawn not to science but to strangeness. Paranormal investigators travel to the pass, bringing cameras, sensors, and equipment meant to capture energy, sound, or spectral activity. Some claim to feel watched while camping near the site. Others report electronic malfunctions or bursts of static in their recorders, echoes eerily similar to the legendary signal. Whether by coincidence or something more, the mountain never fails to feed their obsession. Then there are the storytellers, the late-night hosts and faceless narrators who share Dyatlov's mystery with millions of curious listeners. They speak in hushed tones, weaving fact with fear, inviting their audiences to sit in the dark and imagine those last desperate hours. These stories are not just entertainment. They are rituals, modern campfires where fear and fascination intertwine. And within all of these groups, one detail keeps resurfacing: the call. That fractured, static-filled signal has become a symbol of the case. Amateur radio enthusiasts replay it endlessly, convinced that hidden within the distortion lies the truth. Some slow it down, others speed it up, hoping for clarity. A few claim to hear new fragments each time,
as though the message is evolving with the listener. This obsession speaks to something deeply human, the need to hear a voice in the silence,
to believe that the dead still have something to say. It is comforting in a way to imagine that the hikers tried to reach out, and terrifying to imagine that the message may not have been meant for us at all. Modern fascination has not solved the mystery, it has amplified it. The Dyatlov Pass remains not just a place, but a story without an ending, one that refuses to be silenced.
And for many, that is the allure.
Because the moment the mystery is solved, the voices stop. Until then, we are left with the static and the growing fear of what might emerge if we ever hear the message in full. If every theory, every discovery, and every whisper has built towards something, it is this: the recording many now call the final call. A single broadcast that, for those who believe, captures the exact moment when silence gave way to terror, and then was consumed by it forever. The story begins with a small group of radio operators who claimed, decades after the Dyatlov tragedy, that their receivers picked up something unusual near the anniversary of the hiker's disappearance. At first, it was nothing more than static, a hollow rush like wind caught inside metal. But then, beneath the noise, a rhythm emerged, fragments of words, faint and broken. The operators adjusted their dials, straining to hear, and then unmistakably voices. They were not calm. They were urgent, overlapping, as though several people were trying to speak at once. Some shouted single words, "Run!"
Cole, don't.
Others were quieter, pleading as if calling out to one another in the dark. The static rose and fell, swallowing syllables whole before spitting them back in distorted bursts. It was chaos, and yet within the chaos lay something horrifyingly human: fear. The operators who listened that night never forgot it. One described the sensation not as hearing a broadcast, but as intruding on a moment he was never meant to witness. It was like opening a door, he said, and realizing someone inside was screaming to be let out. Then came the climax. After minutes of broken fragments, the signal seemed to stabilize. The voices grew louder, clearer, until suddenly they screamed in unison. Not words, not language, just raw sound. Human throats tearing against the weight of something unseen. And just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The static cut to silence so sharp that listeners swore they could still hear the echo inside their own ears. No one has ever explained this broadcast. Skeptics dismiss it as a hoax, a trick of shortwave frequencies, or the mind's tendency to create patterns where none exist. Yet those who heard it insist it was real, too real, and once heard, impossible to forget. What makes the final call so disturbing is not just the sound, but the question it leaves behind. Who exactly was calling? Were these truly the voices of the 9 hikers, trapped in some strange loop of time, forever replaying their final moments? Or was it something else, something imitating them, using their memory as a mask to lure others closer? The ambiguity is the heart of the terror. Because if the voices belong to the hikers, then we are listening to the raw edge of death itself, frozen into sound. But if they did not, then what force waits on that mountain, calling out in voices we recognize, only to lead us deeper into its silence? Even today, the tape surfaces in shadowed corners of the internet, usually degraded, always incomplete. People play it late at night, headphones on, straining to hear the fragments. And though every version sounds different, the pattern is the same. Static, broken pleas, the swell of voices, then the scream. The silence that follows feels less like an ending and more like a door closing, which leaves one final question. The one whispered among believers and skeptics alike. If you heard the final call with perfect clarity, would you answer? Because if the dead can speak from Dyatlov Pass, perhaps they aren't speaking to us. Perhaps they're speaking for us, reminding the living that some mountains never give back their secrets. The end. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains exactly what it has always been, a silence that refuses to be broken. The hikers are long gone, their bodies buried by snow and time, but the questions they left behind still linger like footprints that never fade. We have their photographs, their journals, their torn tent, and now perhaps their voices. Yet none of it fits neatly together. None of it offers comfort. Some believe the signal was never real, just a story that grew out of the hunger for answers. Others are certain they have heard something unexplainable, fragments of terror replaying across decades. Whether fact, illusion, or something darker, the result is the same. The mystery of Dyatlov has become more than history. It has become a warning, a legend wrapped in frost and static. And perhaps that is the point. The truth may never come in the form of an official report or a scientific breakthrough. It may never come at all, because Dyatlov is not simply about what happened to 9 hikers on a winter night. It is about the human need to listen into silence, to strain our ears for echoes, to believe that answers still exist beyond the snow. But mountains keep their own counsel. They do not explain, they do not apologize. They hold, they bury, they wait. And in the case of Dyatlov, the mountain has done more than hold its dead. It has given us just enough to keep wondering, just enough to keep us listening. So if you find yourself drawn to the signal, if you press your ear to the static late at night,
Ask yourself, do you want to hear what it has to say?
or is it safer to let the silence remain? Because not every message is meant to be finished. Some are better left broken, half-formed, forever incomplete. The hikers' laughter once echoed across those slopes, their voices bright and full of life. Now, if the legends are true, their final cries still ride the wind, stitched into the fabric of the mountain itself. Whether those calls are warnings, pleas, or traps, we may never know. But one thing is certain. Dyatlov Pass will never let us forget them. And so we leave the mountain as we found it, cold, silent, unyielding, a place where the line between memory and myth has blurred, where every unanswered call still drifts in the snow. Some mountains give back their dead. Dyatlov never did.
It only keeps calling.